Welcome back to the Atlantic Council live at the IMF-World Bank Meetings in Marrakesh. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. This is our final event of IMF World Bank Week, coming after over 30 events, a dozen finance ministers and central bank governors, 4 new reports launched, 40 live blog analytical updates from the events going on, video content, trying to bring you in Washington and around the world inside the IMF World Bank meetings, these critical meetings here in Morocco. And for our final event, what I wanted to do was unpack and debrief the meetings with the team that has helped put this together, part of my team at the Geoeconomic Center. So I'd like to welcome in Sophia Bush and Mugank Boussari, 2 of the amazing people who have helped make this possible in Marrakesh, planning not just over the past few weeks, but over the past few months. So we're going to have a conversation. We're going to get into some of the details, both substantive and operational, that have really come to the forefront in the past few days here in Marrakesh. Sophia, I want to start with you. It is your first IMF World Bank Annual Meetings. Gank, your first IMF World Bank Annual Meetings. What surprised you? What did you think these would be like, and how have they been different?
Well, Josh, first I'm going to be diplomatic and say thank you so much for having us here. I know it's no small thing to be able to attend so early in our careers. So yeah, I think this has been a really important week for me, and just seeing how the international financial community works. I've only seen IMF World Bank meetings from our DC perspective, mostly from our Atlantic Council offices. So I've known that, you know, it's so important for finance ministers to come in and represent their countries and demonstrate their economic trajectories and instill confidence. But I think one of the things that surprised me is that this whole week is a performance. You know, this is one big theater, and it's not one-sided. It's not just the finance ministers instilling confidence. It's the IMF also demonstrating we're a relevant institution. We have power that we're wielding in an important and good way. And so I think just seeing the mutual performance of all sides has been surprising, and I think maybe a cynic would say that this is nothing but pomp and circumstance, but I do think and I hope that it's a stage that's set up for a reason, because it takes having something significant happen. It takes star-studded coffee lines to be able to get everyone together to start working on things.
Yeah, it's true. You don't see so much financial power in one place at one time.
No.
And you're right, it is about the IMF as much as it's about the finance ministers. And I think you hit on an important point about their relevance and the importance of them putting on a good show and what they mean. And they will say, and you see this tomorrow in the IMFC communique, they'll say, key to the global financial safety net, and that is about IMF's relevance. And we'll get into the substance of the meetings in a minute, but I think that's an interesting key takeaway. Gank, what surprised you?
Josh, the thing that surprised me the most is just the fact that they pulled it off such a great conference, given that the earthquake happened a month ago.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
And it's immensely been, the earthquake was not that far away.
Yeah.
And even walking in the Medina, you can see ruins, you can see the impact.
You're staying not far from where the ruins are.
And so the fact that they've been able to pull off such a great conference and get really important meetings happening here has been by itself really impressive. The other thing that I was really surprised by, maybe surprised is the wrong word, but that I saw in action in these meetings is the importance of person-to-person relationships. And even though people are here to represent national interest, and ultimately you could say that that trumps everything else, you can see the impact of having friends around, of people you've worked with for 10, 15 years, even if you're on the opposite sides of the end. That willingness to go the extra mile to try to get a solution, to try to reach an agreement. Is just there, but also you can also see it on the other way, where you have personal animus and enmities, and those play in as well, and areas where there could be agreement just because you don't like another person, and it really comes down to that personal relationships at times.
That's really interesting, because when I worked at the IMF, I also had that takeaway of, you think from the outside that they come in, they do their business, and they leave. But just like anywhere else, personal politics are at play, who, career issues for who, what this person's job is going to be next. And when you realize that, you can help understand some of the decision making. And I do think it's valuable, and I hope you've both seen some of those dynamics play out. When you ask one finance minister about another finance minister, you can tell if they have a close relationship or not, or how often they're in communication. And that does make a difference, and it really makes a difference in a crisis. Because sure, okay, you're dealing with the business of the fund, but when COVID hit, so the global financial crisis is, and you need to call up a colleague, the fact that you just saw them 2 weeks ago in Morocco, and you have that personal, in-person relationship, does make a difference.
Yeah.
So substantively, Sophia, what big themes did you take away? What, were there things that were talked about more than you thought other things, if we're thinking about the big takeaways from the meeting?
So I think there's a difference between some of the main headlines that we've been seeing, but then also the bigger questions that I'm left with. So I think the obvious things that everyone's been talking about, we're talking about debt, specifically when are we going to get an MOU from Zambia?
Still waiting.
Still waiting. Yeah, we're talking about debt, and we're talking about quotas. How are we going to address quota reform? What does consensus look like on that? But then I think there's also just bigger questions of what is the IMF's role? Where does mission creep, where does that belong? How should that be treated? Yeah, so I think there's those little things, and then there's the bigger questions, and usually there's the little things come back to those big questions.
I agree with that. It's interesting to me how much policy was debated at these meetings, and we'll see again tomorrow will be kind of the final communique and some of the wrap up. But yes, on debt, there may be a significant breakthrough. I've gone through a lot of IMF annual meetings and spring meetings where there are no breakthroughs on any significant issues, so that's one. Role of the IMF and the World Bank that you alluded to, Sophia, what is their mandate? I do think President Banga's first meeting generated a lot of energy in that, and we can talk about that more. So I agree with your takeaways on debt, on role of the IMF and World Bank. These were talked about every day in almost every interview we did here. Gang?
Josh, I made a list of words that I'd heard
let's hear
frequently.
It. Okay, I'm curious. I can guess some. Challenges.
So challenges, shocks, volatility, resilience, silver lining. So it's.
I thought you were going to say equiproportional.
That's interesting.
Equiproportional.
What about STRs?
It gives you the sense that the mood has been very gloomy. It's uncertainty plagues this conference, and there's big challenges up ahead, and it's very unclear how the global economy navigates them. In debt distress, climate change, and inflation. It's unclear how we progress from here, and the big theme, and as we mentioned, the role of the IMF and the World Bank going forward. And for me, the way I was thinking about it is that history really is the greatest asset that these institutions have, but also the greatest liability. Because it's an asset in that the World Bank, the IMF, throughout in the last 70, 80 years, have reduced poverty by incredible margins. The work they've done on poverty, on technical assistance, they've generated incredible amounts of institutional knowledge and a wealth of information and knowledge to give out, but at the same time they have major issues. Their history also prevents them from making major changes because there's a path that they've followed. We talked about how the IMF World Bank were thought through during the World War II, during the Second World War, 1944. Yeah. But the countries and the governments that are asking for a greater representation now, or that want to bring in reforms, literally did not exist in 1944. Yeah. India became independent in 1947. Yeah. The People's Republic of China was established in 1950.
World, different global economy.
So these countries had absolutely no voice, literally zero voice. When
this is the fly that's been all week has been part of our.
It's a panelist as well.
And, distinguished guest.
Yeah. And so it's really difficult to change your path once you've been down a path for 70 years because Western voice and representation and interests have been entrenched in the system. And so to change that, it's incredibly hard. And so just an hour ago, Nirmala Sitharaman, who's the Indian finance minister, in an event with us confirmed that proportional quota increase will pass through.
Yeah, this is a
and
big
she said it's a temporary solution. Yeah. But is there any silver lining we see there, that there will be a permanent solution? We all agree it's temporary, but what next?
I mean, you ask a good question because I went through the last quota reform. I was at the IMF. And the same thing was said, we will not do this again. But here we are. So it
Yeah.
is hard to imagine 4 years from now what would change so significantly from a US side, from a China side, from an India side. On the other hand, I take her point, something has to change because the emerging markets, the global south, as she said, will not do this forever. And I do believe these institutions are important, so there has to be a bigger conversation to be had. Sophia, let's talk about quotas for a second. I mean, this is a technical issue, but it's an important issue because it has to do with whether the membership has faith in the institution and whether they fund the institution. And the IMF at the bottom, at the end of the day, is about lending money, so funding the
Right.
institution is pretty critical. What has been your thoughts on this quota conversation this week?
So I think, yes, it's about who funds the institution, but I think it's also about who has stake
Yeah.
and influence in the institution. And I remember Martin Mulheisen saying in an event earlier that it would be foolish to let China have more shares
Yeah, I
because
remember
it would block Western agendas. And so then I think if we don't change things, then there's a lot of these influential countries are left out.
Yeah.
And yes, maybe that would help Western agenda, but then I think also how can the institution be relevant if we're leaving out these countries? So it's I think that trade-off, and nobody really knows what to do with
There's
that.
no easy answers.
Which is I think why it's going to linger
Yeah.
for quite some time.
I agree with you. Gunk, if you were in Treasury right now and you were advising Jay Shamba and those who made that speech, what would your position be? Would it be the same one they have?
Josh, I would really explain, and I know you've been there. It's
Yeah.
a difficult job, but the world has changed since 1944.
Yeah.
The U.S. and Europe dominated the global economy when it came to GDP, global GDP, trade, capital stock. And so any country that was, especially countries that were decolonizing, if they were not in the communist bloc, if they wanted to integrate in the global economy, you had no choice but to collaborate with the U.S. and Europe. But that's simply not the case anymore. So the BRICS countries have become prominent in the global economy, but you also have regional multilateral development banks, you have pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, a lot of other actors that are becoming increasingly relevant. And so the US and Europe are not automatic partners. They're not automatically, they don't automatically have influence at the World Bank or through the World Bank. And so if the World Bank, the IMF, do not put through changes and put them soon, we will see these countries and especially the countries, look at other avenues to voice their opinions on the global economy, or to voice their action and their leverage in the global economy.
I think I thought it was interesting in my interview with India's finance minister that I brought up BRICS, and she said, I want to put BRICS to the side. At this venue, the BRICS conversation is not very popular, right? Because you're in a multilateral 189 member Western, heavily influenced institution. And on the other hand, India is getting more deeply involved in BRICS. We just saw the announcement. So I agree with you that should this continue, then there will be some kind of transition. That's not the focus of these meetings, but a few years from now, you could see that. Okay, one more substance question, and then I want to give some background of how we put this all together. So there's the annual meetings, there's the spring meetings, they happen on this cycle. How do you see the distinction between the World Bank and the IMF versus what you thought maybe a few years ago before you started working in geoeconomics or even coming into these meetings? Have you learned things about the distinction between the two, either over the last few years or even just the last few weeks? Sophia.
Okay. I remember I interned for the U.S. Trade Representative a couple years ago, and I remember walking past both buildings on my way there while I was a GW student. And to me, at the time, they meant very little and also kind of the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in having that thought.
Okay.
A lot.
Maybe I'm outing myself here.
I think a lot of people feel that.
But I think beyond, I think my impression is that the World Bank they're addressing so much.
Yeah.
And then beyond the IMF just being a little bit more technocratic and, liking getting caught up in their little technical terms.
that does happen.
I don't know. I think it's it's the lender of last resort. I think there is importance in having it have its clear role, which is like when you look at Ukraine, we had the Ukrainian finance minister come here and he talked about how instrumental that emergency funding from the IMF was. And we follow all of these countries as we work on the guide and all of our projects, and it's such an important thing for the IMF to be that lender. So I think when we're talking about mission creep and the differences in the roles of these institutions, that seems clear. And then, you know, if it goes beyond that, I think that's kind of where it gets a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think that the mission creep's a real issue. Nicole Golden has a blog coming out. I don't know if it's out yet on our Lucy. Her title, which I really like, is Mission Creep or Mission Critical. And I thought that's a really nice frame of it. Yes, mission creep, but the mission creep is about climate, something that is fundamental to every country in the world's survival. So where do you draw these lines of whose job is whose? And to your point, yes, the global economy has changed. The world has changed in 75 years. And so the issues that we would have thought were core IMF issues in 1944 or even 1971 after the end of Nixon shock and the gold standard, those can change too. The question is, how do you reassess that and make it part of the mission? And this is something both institutions are struggling with, as you can see. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I really want to talk a little bit behind the scenes, take people in who've been watching us all week. How did we do this? We're at the IMF World Bank venue. We're not officially part of the IMF or World Bank. We're the Atlantic Council. We're a think tank. So Gonk, let me start with you. When did you start sending out invitations, along with our colleagues from centers across the council, to host guests here during the week?
It was literally 2 weeks after the April meetings.
So 6 months ago.
Yes, every Monday, Josh, since May, begins with a message from you, let's follow up. And every Monday, and I've been doing that every week.
Let's follow up, yes.
And so it's been a long process. It's been a drawn-out process. And this one, especially with it being in Marrakesh, being international, we've had a larger team, and everyone around the team has really been pulling the weight on different aspects of this event, because you know, we've had a whole logistics team, a whole publications team, videos team.
They're still working
They're
now.
Still here. And so it's been a really major operation with everyone coordinating with each other.
And Sophia, a big part of what we talked about as a team was we are coming at the Atlantic Council to Morocco. How do we bring that back to Washington? And we tried to come up with all different ways through editorial, social. Take us through, you've led a lot of this. What was the theory of how we take what we're doing here but make sure folks back home can see it and appreciate it and hopefully learn from it?
Right, well, there's the time zone difference.
Yes,
so that was probably one of the first conversations.
If you interview a minister at 9 a.m.
Right. But then I think it was also trying to figure out what's important. What do we have to offer? You know, there's CNBC. Sorry, I can't get rid of this
the fly. Has
it's making its revenge tour on the last event here.
I know.
It's a statement.
It's okay. He can come along for the ride. But one more speaker. But so I think.
But your point, CNBC, Bloomberg, right? There's media organizations here who are doing interviews, and we're trying to do something different.
Yeah, but what we have to offer, we have these experts, and they've been writing so much here on the ground. So it's just getting that back to everyone in DC, and then also we're trying to be people's eyes and ears within the meetings. But then when we were planning for this, we didn't know what the meetings were going to be like. So I think the interesting part for me was trying to plan ahead and prepare for what you don't know. And that's rough because you can't really put pieces into place when you don't know what's going to be happening.
That's right.
So it's preparing a strategy around flexibility, I think.
And something we never did before as a council, as a team. I mean, we just never have done anything like this. And then, of course, Gonk, less than a month ago, there was a shock. There was an earthquake. And immediately, everyone asked the natural question, first, humanitarian, what can we do? Second, are the meetings going to happen? And we had to try to adapt to that as a team.
Yeah, we paused we paused invites, we paused some events that we were doing, private events outside. And so it was very just uncertainty. It was the global economy in practice in the office. And not knowing what's going to happen, we were waiting official statements or even unofficial statements on what are we expecting? Are we still going to go ahead with this? Do we still keep our flights? You know, those kinds of
all the logistical concerns of bringing a team out. Yeah, and I think it became clear a few days after that the Moroccan authorities really wanted these meetings to go on. I think they, and you've seen this week, they feel, and I think it's been supported, that this is an important statement, good for the Moroccan economy, but good more broadly to show resilience of what's happening here on the ground. I want to think through a little bit of the individual preparation that goes into these events. 30 events, as I say. There's a lot of background work we have to do to make sure we are prepared as a team. Sophia, Gang, you both led a lot of this. Sophia, from your perspective, what do we actually do before? We don't just show up here on set, despite what people think. Hopefully it doesn't look like that.
No. So some of my job has been making sure our moderators know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Josh.
Well, I hope people feel you did a good job. I thought you did a great job.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Did you have the questions for this?
Yeah, there was no prep memo.
Last night I was working on it. What do I want to talk about?
Yeah.
No. So yeah, I think there were probably 15, 16 countries we got you background research for and questions for. I liked that part probably the most because I felt like I had a real influence on the events and I got to look at all around the world what's happening in the economy. But then I think there's a lot of other things that happen. There was the question of how do people watch this? Where is it? What does it look like? So then it was working together with so many different teams, from graphics to our website team. We published 4 reports, so we were working with our publications team. And it was just kind of figuring out, okay, we're doing like 20 plus events. How are people going to watch it? There needs to be graphics, there needs to be links, there needs to be titles, descriptions, everything.
There's 1,000 moving pieces to this. That's right.
Yeah.
And Gang, from your end, some of the preparations that have gone into this?
For me, it was a lot of coordinating, of making sure that the different aspects, moving parts of the puzzle were in order, or they were still, you can still see all those pieces because sometimes they just get lost. And by also communicating with the embassies and making sure that they had all the information they need in terms of the background on the events, what's happening next, when to come, and like what kinds of topics we want to cover.
Yeah, I mean, what people don't fully understand is the scheduling for these meetings is incredibly intense because the ministers and the governors are back to back to back. They've come here in between 14 or 15 meetings in a day, so for them to come here at a certain time, it is a jigsaw puzzle that has to get put together on their schedules, on our schedules, and then of course things change. I think the Ukrainian finance minister was a great example. We weren't sure he'd be able to come given his busy schedule. He had said he had hoped to, and very last minute he said he could, and then we were shifting times throughout the day. And that's part of the IMF World Bank meetings because the ministers have important jobs to do, and we appreciate that they're taking the time and making time to be here with us. Other things in the operation side that surprised either of you as we prepared for it?
Well, I'm glad that I'm not the person that has to be coordinating everything on the ground. We have a VETA for that.
Yeah.
I'm glad I don't have to do that job because it's a lot, and it was really nice coming in and having
global events.
Everything kind of set a little bit.
Yeah.
This is my first international trip with the council.
Oh,
I've been surprised by how nice it is. It's there's nice dinners. There's nice, just a nice, also just a nice vibe around the team. So it's a fun experience.
So Sophia, Gank, I think our team's going to come out in a minute, and I want to say a few words. But final thoughts from both of you. You have been key to the Bretton Woods 2.0 project, key to everything we do across the Geoeconomic Center. The reason you're here is because you've been so integral. I want to give you the chance to say, what do you think we should be doing as a center going forward on these issues? So, Sophia, I started with you, so I'll start with you, Gank, and the final question, and end with you, Sophia.
Oof, that's the end of your review question.
End of your review scaled up a few weeks.
On camera.
Yeah, no pressure.
I think we have to do a lot more on the World Bank. As I don't, if you followed us this week, you've noticed that we have a very strong IMF focus.
That's part of my own biases.
Is from the IMF, and having more detailed analysis of what does World Bank reform look like, or where does the World Bank go from here. I think that would be really important.
I think that's a really good takeaway, something I'm always struggling with. You have a natural bias to talk more about the institution you came from. I do feel Washington has a lot of World Bank conversations, so I thought we could add more in the IMF, but we need to find the right balance as an institution. Sophia?
So I think I was having a conversation with Gank a couple nights ago, And
Off the record.
Is that on camera?
right, sorry. But I think, I don't know, I was saying something along the lines of, in a nice way, I'm really not sure how confident I am that the IMF will ever change. And I think coming here has made it feel a little bit more real that people are actually talking about reform. But I think what we could do more is talk about even just like the little tiny tangible steps. When are the deadlines? What does it actually mean? Who's pushing for what?
Yeah.
Just to make it feel a little more concrete. And also I think that would make it more accessible, because coming here, there's actually in the press room, they have these booklets with all of the different IMF terms. And when I say booklets, it's books. It's like full dictionary definition lists of terms. And so it's not the most accessible issues to understand, but you say this all the time, it does actually impact real people.
Yeah, and that's one role we can play at the Geoeconomic Center across the Atlantic Council, helping explain it, because it does matter to people's lives. And we can only do it because we work with centers across the council. We have worked here on the ground with Empower Me and the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East and our Africa Center, but we've coordinated with centers across the council to make this possible. Sophia, Gank, I thank you both. Congratulations on getting through your first, but not your last, IMF-World Bank Annual Meetings. Before we close, I want to say something as we conclude our Atlantic Council programming for this week. This has been a dark and difficult week, following a dark and difficult year. Terror attacks in Israel, war in Gaza, following war in Europe. More conflict across a range of countries and regions than the world has seen in decades. And I'd like to remind everyone watching and has watched throughout this week that the IMF and the World Bank, the entire Bretton Woods system, were founded not after war, but during war in 1944. We often say they were founded in the ashes of war, but that's not true. They were founded in the fire of war, around the time of D-Day. There was a realization at that moment, even as soldiers were fighting across Europe and Asia, that cooperation on a monetary system and development assistance, if done well, could lead to more economic prosperity and therefore lead to more peace. And the amazing thing is that while imperfect and suffering many failures, that system actually by and large worked. And it created a relative, emphasis on relative, period of peace over the last 75 years since the creation of these institutions. And we can look around the world today and say that is no longer the case. So if there was ever a moment for these institutions to work once again and realize their full potential, to be reformed, to be revitalized, to be re-energized, it is now. It is the same impetus, the same energy of when these institutions were created. And we, as an organization, as a council, as a think tank, but as a community that cares about these issues, have to reinvest our efforts to do it, because the alternative is fracturing, fragmentation, conflict, poverty, and war. But if the work is done well, it can lead to a better outcome, and we've seen that proven true in the post-World War II era. And that's why we will continue to make the Bretton Woods 2.0 project not just a priority, but core to the work of the Atlantic Council. I want to thank everyone here in Marrakesh and in Washington, D.C. who made this possible. We have an incredible team here on the ground who have worked day and night to bring you these meetings. From videos to editing to social media, everything that was possible, technologically challenging, was done because of the commitment and the creativity of our team. And that's what you can continue to expect from the Geoeconomic Center and the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us. We wish everyone a good weekend, a good week ahead, and we look forward to seeing you back in Washington.